who look at me and say, Rev, we've never seen this before. This is the worst thing we've ever seen. And I've had to tell them, hold on now. Don't ever say that. It is a desperation that gives too much power to extremism. And it disrespects the hard struggles like the struggle against slavery and the Trail of Tears and the fight for women's suffrage and the fight for LGBTQ rights and the fight against Jim Crow and the fight against apartheid. Don't give this Trumpism too much credit. Don't make yourselves grasshoppers. But the second thing is, when you say we've never seen this before, it's just not accurate. It's not historically accurate. Princeton historian Nell Irvin Painter has named the pattern we are witness, and she calls it America's call and response. She says what we are seeing here is the iconography of a tragic, traditionally American call and response. What am I talking about? Can I teach for a moment? In the 19th century, following the Civil War, black and white fusion coalitions came together in the South. And together, black and white people in the 1800s reconstructed this nation as a republic that would, in fact, guarantee liberty. That it was a new birth of the nation. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments corrected the 3/5 compromise. They rewrote the Constitution, black and white together. They guaranteed all persons the right to life, liberty, the fruit of their own labor, the pursuit of happiness. They guaranteed voting rights. They guaranteed criminal justice, more criminal justice fairness. They guaranteed public education, black and white together, more than 150 years ago. They even put in place a tax system that would ensure that the wealthy paid their fair share so that they could change what had happened because of the disenfranchisement of slaves. But what came with that call was a response. This radically democratic call invoked a violent backlash called the redemption movement or the deconstruction movement. The Ku Klux Klan arose in the South not to first attack white people, but black people, but to attack white people who work with black people. Yes, we saw them rally and they joined together. They joined together to be regressive. They joined together to turn back public policy. They could not stand public education for all. They could not stomach fair criminal justice reform. They could not stand voting rights for all. They thought that black and white people working together was sin. And so their mantra was, we got to take our country back and make it great again. I'm talking about in 1800. And they began to deconstruct, which ended with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And then finally a president, long before a white supremacist like Bannon was in the White House, Woodrow Wilson brought white supremacy in the White House when he played the movie Birth of a Nation in the White House that was written by a playwright from Cleveland County who was a legislator right here in North Carolina. I'm here to tell you, this is not the first time America's had to deal with racism. Then there was the emergence of a second Reconstruction, doing what we sometimes call the Civil Rights Movement. Black and white people began to come together along with immigrants and women and poor folk and gay people and labor. And out of that movement, language changed. Presidents started talking about civil rights as a moral issue, voting rights as a moral issue. We got the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68, the War on Poverty. These were the fruits of decades of struggle, expansion of Social Security, minimum wage. And they were waged, these battles, by people who knew they might never see the victory in their own lifetime. But they won so much. But then to that call, Rodney, was a response, a backlash. This time it wasn't limited to Southern segregationists. Richard Nixon ran a campaign on law and order. Tricky Dick, y'all remember him. came up a campaign in 1968. He had to figure out a way to out Wallace without sounding racist. So Kevin Phillips, his advisor, said, I know how you can win. Let's develop something called the Southern Strategy. Let's not talk about race openly. Let's talk about race in code words like entitlement reform, tax cuts, states' rights. Yeah, new code language. So let's don't say the N-word. And then let's find out who hates who and pit them against one another, because we've got to break up this black and white and brown coalition. And they used that trickery called the Southern Strategy so that they could lock up the South and lock up some of the Rust Belt and the West Belt and certain suburbs in the North. But they were really after the South, because they knew that if they could cause black and white people to turn from each other rather than turn to each other, then they could control 171 electoral votes with just 13 states. They could control 26 Senate seats with just 13 states. They could control 31% of the United States House of Representatives with just 13 states. They could control 13 governors and 13 legislatures. And they knew if they could divide and conquer, they could break the Second Reconstruction. And Dr. Painter says, in this moment, my brothers and sisters, we must be as wise as serpents. Well, actually, Jesus said that, and harmless as doves. But Sister Painter says we got to understand this moment in the context of an election and re-election of a president who was black, with a wife who was black, with a daughter who was black, who had pajama parties in a White House built by slaves. And you've got to understand that we're in a period of reclamation and response. And by the way, the motto of the Southern Strategy was, we got to take our country back and make it great again. It began the moment President Obama broke through in the South. They wanted him to be a one-term president. They refused to govern. They let the lie go forward about birtherism. They called him a lie on the congressional floor. Countless visual stereotypes. And what Ms. Painter says, if we don't get this, we miss what's really going on in this moment. Without Barack Obama, there is no Donald Trump. Trump is obviously unsuited for the job of President of the United States. But he is suited to answer the call of reclamation and deconstruction and white lash that is as American as apple pie. My sisters and brothers, let us be clear. There's nothing unprecedented about Trump, nothing unprecedented about the extremists we see in these legislatures. There's always been this ebb and flow in American history. And there have always been people who will appeal to the lesser angels of our nature, that is as American as the red, white, and blue. But you also must hear me, this is not just about a president. We miss it if we think it is. This is about an entire web of money and influence and white hegemony that has been working to tie up the American democracy from the very inception of this country. And they've been working not from DC down, but from school boards and county commissioners and state legislatures up. That is why they fear a crowd like this. Even as the divide between the rich and the poor is the widest in our nation's history, our electorate is growing more diverse every year. And wealthy oligarchs know that they cannot hold on to power in truly democratic elections. So what we are witnessing is an all-out assault, foreign and domestic, on the very heart of our democracy. And this is not simply about the preservation of the Democratic Party or any party, or simply the preservation of a government conceived by human beings. We are in a moment that is fundamentally another chapter of history. This is about the well-being of creation and the survival of those creatures who bear the very image of God, you and I. We live in a moment when millions desperately need a government and a society with a heart. Millions of Americans need health care and living wages and protection from xenophobia and systemic racism and homophobia and religious bigotry and climate destruction. This is about our humanity.